Alright, so we've got a 2014 Malibu here, and today we're going to talk a little bit about just basic engine diagnostics, some initial tests that you can do when you first come up to a vehicle that's having a drivability issue. So we're going to go ahead and start it up. And almost immediately, as soon as I start it up, I can feel quite a bit of vibration. I'm sure you can see the camera shaking. Check engine lights on. Give you a shot of the gauge cluster here, and if I put the camera on the steering wheel, you get a little bit of vibration. You can definitely feel it in the seat. I don't know if I set it on my knee here, if you can feel it, but you can definitely tell the vehicle's vibrating quite a bit. So one of the first or most common complaints that would result in a vibration like this is a misfire of some sort. So we're going to take a look under the hood. See what we can see. So one of the difficult concepts to understand for most new technicians is that some of your more useful tools are just your eyes and ears. So when we look at this engine, just looking at it, we can tell it's running pretty roughly. If I set the camera on here, to give you a better idea, see the camera's bouncing around and everything like that. So it is running quite rough. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do what's called a power balance test. So this is one of the basic checks you can do. It doesn't require any tools whatsoever. And we're going to do it with ignition coils. So we're going to go through and we're going to disconnect all these ignition coils one by one. And what we're watching for is we're watching for the condition of the engine to not decrease. So you see it gets rougher there. So we're going to plug that one back in. So that means that cylinder is essentially contributing to how the engine's running. When we hit up on the cylinder that's not contributing, that one's contributing, that one's contributing, see, when we hit on the cylinder that's not contributing, that's the cylinder that's misfiring. So you notice when I unplug that fourth coil on that fourth cylinder, there was no change. So I can plug it in and unplug it, and I see virtually no change in how the engine operates. So it doesn't get any rougher like the other cylinders did, and it doesn't get any smoother. So right there, that's a quick test. It took me about 5 minutes to do this test. That's a quick test that you can do on just about any vehicle. That will try to isolate the cylinder that might be the problem cylinder. So now we know we only need to go to cylinder 4 to evaluate this engine condition further. So we're going to go ahead and shut this off. And one thing I want you to note with this vehicle in particular, that this misfire is actually bad enough that if you try to drive the vehicle, it will start flashing the check engine light. And what that means is that when that check engine light starts or begins to flash, that means it's what's called a Class A misfire. And there's two classes of misfire. There's a Class A and a Class B. The Class B misfire is less damaging. A Class A misfire means that the misfire rate that the PCM is measuring is actually high enough that it could damage the catalytic converter. So this is a very basic test to kind of isolate which cylinder is misfiring. Sometimes when you have a flashing check engine light, it could either be a multiple cylinder misfire, in which case you'll set a PO 300. It could also be a single cylinder misfire. So it really depends on what kind of failure you have and things like that. But that's kind of one of those side of the road items that you can diagnose really quickly and try to determine, is this something that's more major or more systemic, or is it something that is relegated to one cylinder only. So a good example of this would be some older vehicles that maybe have a little bit of age on them. The intake piping, so I'll come out here and actually show you again. The intake piping underneath the hood. So this is on this vehicle, this is our mass airflow right here. So anything beyond that mass airflow, all the way down to the throttle body, which is actually just tucked right underneath there, Anything down from between that mass airflow and that throttle body needs to be sealed. If it is not sealed, we're going to get what's called uncalculated air or false air. And what that means is that mass airflow is not able to read that air. Since it's not able to read that air, it's not able to accurately predict how much air is coming into the engine. So that can be a bad thing. That can cause a multiple cylinder misfire. So if this vehicle were on the side of the road and I had no tools with me, which is uncommon, but if I had no tools with me to diagnose it, and I was concerned whether or not I should tow it home or if I should attempt to drive it home, that would be one check that I could do. Is I could do that power balance test, and I could also inspect all of those hoses and things like that to make sure that those are intact. That will cause a very, very rough running engine oftentimes. It'll also cause an engine that won't respond properly to throttle inputs. So those are some quick checks that you can do. So visually, as we check over this engine, if we pretend that we don't know that it's cylinder 4 misfiring, there's a lot of little things that we can take a look at. So we can look at this mass airflow sensor. Typically nowadays they're mounted with brackets to some sort of intake tube. We can look at all this air induction hoses and things like that. I like to give them a squeeze and actually flex them because they do flex during engine operation. See, that clamp right there is actually loose, so that could cause an issue. So we'll want to tighten that up. There's another clamp here. That one seems pretty tight. If we go over here to this other side, all of these clamps, that looks like it's tight. And then down here where it's getting kind of dark, down in the bottom there's that throttle body, so I can't quite get to that clamp, but I can take a look at all these hoses, this intake resonance box, and all of those things, because I want to determine, okay, is this something that I might be able to drive home? Is this something that I really would rather get a tow for? Because I really don't want to burn up a catalytic converter by driving with a misfire that's so substantial. So in this case, this vehicle has an issue. We need to take a look at and further diagnose this issue. So at this point, being that the check engine light flashes continuously when you drive it, this would be something that I would recommend you tow home versus trying to drive home. If you try to drive this vehicle home, chances are you will burn up the catalyst. So another clue is a little bit of rotten egg smell. So while this vehicle is running, if we come back here and use our sniffer, and by sniffer I mean your nose, you will smell a rotten egg smell coming out of the rear of this vehicle as it's running. So this is definitely a Class A misfire, something that's damaging the catalysts. We can also classify this as a wet misfire. And what that means is that we're probably injecting fuel into that cylinder. We're just not igniting it and burning it. So that could be, we've essentially narrowed it down to one of the three things, but we're pretty sure we're still getting fuel in that cylinder because of the rotten egg smell. That rotten egg smell means that the catalyst is getting too hot, which is typically indicative of it burning off a lot of excess fuel from a misfire. So we're pretty sure we're getting fuel. We probably want to look at spark first, just because it's easier to get to. And then if we want to dive further, we'd go into maybe a leak down test or a running compression test to check and see if maybe there's a mechanical issue with the cylinder. So yeah. So those are some basic tests, or one of the basic tests you can do. Again, your eyes and your ears will be your greatest diagnostic tool. There are a lot of times that students miss simple clues about how the engine is running, and they miss simple tests that they can do to try to diagnose that engine without any tools. So a lot of times we want to jump straight to a scan tool, or we want to jump straight to pulling the engine apart or investigating. I call it exploratory diagnostics. We don't have to do that. I want to do things as simple as possible. So in this case, we did a simple power balance check. Took about 5 minutes. We isolated one cylinder. We can rule out 3/4 of this engine already. And if we want to go as far as a mechanical engine test, like a leak down or a compression test, we only have to do it on one cylinder. So that's just one way that we can kind of help ourselves with drivability diagnosis. looking for smells, exhaust odors. The other thing is called the paper test. So I'm gonna actually start this vehicle back up. I can reach the key here. So if we go back here to the back of this vehicle, I'm gonna have to find a small sheet of paper here, which occasionally can be an issue. Alright, we're back. We're going to do what's called the paper test. So I have a little sheet of paper. This is the airbag tag outside of the vehicle. And the exhaust hose so kindly pops off. If you notice during a misfire how the paper flaps like that, that is typically very indicative of a misfire. So on this vehicle, it's a pretty substantial misfire. And it's a pretty drastic result. I'm gonna put the hose back on right away. So it's a pretty drastic result with that paper test. We call it the paper test. But on vehicles that might have a little bit more subtle misfire, where maybe we're not sure if the vehicle is misfiring, or we're not sure if multiple cylinders are misfiring, the paper test can be really useful. So if the vehicle runs a little bit rough, but maybe it's an intermittent misfire, or it's a misfire that's very, very light, maybe a lean misfire or something like that, where we are combusting in the combustion chamber, we just may have a cylinder that's weak. Essentially, those misfires can be more difficult to diagnose. Those misfires can also be more difficult to isolate and try to figure out whether or not the vehicle is actually misfiring or not. So that paper test is really useful. Again, a very simple test. If you've got a piece of paper in the lab and you're not sure if a vehicle is misfiring, maybe you don't feel it in your butt sitting in the seat quite as often, those sensory items that you can use to exacerbate that effect or take a look at that effect will help you in your diagnosis. So anyway, so that's the paper test. We also talked about the power balance test. We talked about a few other things to look for and watch for during our initial diagnosis when we take in a vehicle with a drivability issue. So that's it.